This professor built his career on tearing down faith, but when he challenged Barron Trump, his arrogance collapsed in a way no one saw coming. You won't believe what happened next. The Grand Auditorium of Columbia University, one of the most prestigious institutions in America, was packed with eager students, their murmurs echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. The air crackled with anticipation as today's event, a debate titled Faith versus Science, the Future of Human Understanding, had drawn some of the brightest young minds from across the country. The audience, composed mostly of students and faculty, settled into their seats as a powerful spotlight illuminated the stage. At the podium stood Professor Jonathan Keating, a celebrated intellectual known for his sharp critiques of religion and his relentless attacks on faith. Age 55, with salt and pepper hair, piercing gray eyes, and a refined British accent, Keating had built a reputation as a fearless atheist, dismantling religious arguments with brutal efficiency. His lectures were more than just academic discussions. They were verbal battlegrounds, where believers were often humiliated before a crowd that relished the spectacle. Among those seated in the audience was Barron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, he sat with calm composure, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Despite the whispers circulating around him, some students skeptical of his presence, others eager to see him embarrassed, Barron remained unfazed, his expression unreadable. Many assumed that he had been invited to the event merely because of his last name, but what they didn't realize was that Barron had earned his seat. A brilliant student with a deep interest in philosophy and theology, he was no stranger to intellectual debates, and today he was about to face one of the most formidable opponents in the academic world. Professor Keating adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned into the microphone, a smirk forming on his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth but edged with condescension, "before we discuss the fallacies of religious thought, let us first acknowledge the elephant in the room." He paused, glancing toward Barron. The crowd chuckled knowingly. "We have, in our audience, a young man whose very existence is a testament to inherited privilege, a name synonymous with power, influence, and I dare say, outdated beliefs." Another ripple of laughter spread through the room. "Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you still believe in your invisible sky god?" The auditorium fell silent. All eyes turned to Barron, waiting for his response. Little did they know, they had just set the stage for one of the most unforgettable intellectual battles of the decade. Professor Keating paced slowly across the stage, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, his hands clasped behind his back in a display of absolute confidence. The overhead lights gleamed off the thick, leather-bound book he held, A Brief History of Rational Thought, a work he had penned years ago, widely regarded as a manifesto against religious superstition. He turned toward the audience, scanning their eager faces before settling his gaze back on Barron Trump, his smirk widening. "Faith," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension, "is the last refuge of those unwilling to embrace reason. It is, and has always been, a psychological crutch, one that shields its believers from the terrifying reality that we are nothing more than biological accidents, floating on a speck of dust in a vast and different universe." A murmur rippled through the audience, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Keating's expression sharpened. "And yet," he continued, "despite the overwhelming advancements of science, despite the unrelenting march of human progress, some still insist on believing in their ancient deities, clutching their prayer books as if they were scientific journals." He chuckled, shaking his head. "It is truly fascinating." Pausing for dramatic effect, he flipped open his book and pointed to a slide behind him where a declining graph of religious belief among university-educated individuals was displayed. "This," he said, gesturing, "is what happens when knowledge replaces ignorance. The more educated a person becomes, the less likely they are to believe in fairy tales." His tone mocked the very idea of faith. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he removed his glasses, narrowed his eyes, and focused squarely on Barron. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with undisguised contempt, "you come from a world of wealth, influence, and inherited privilege, but tell me, do you still believe in your invisible sky god?" Laughter erupted from a section of the audience, while others fell dead silent, sensing the tension that had thickened the room. All eyes turned to Barron, waiting, expecting his defeat. Professor Keating folded his arms, smirking. He thought he had won, but he had no idea what was coming next. For a moment, the room remained still, the echoes of laughter fading into a tense silence. All eyes were fixed on Barron Trump, waiting for his reaction. Some expected him to shift uncomfortably in his seat, to mumble an incoherent defense, or to evade the professor's challenge altogether. Instead, Barron did something no one anticipated. With the poise of a seasoned statesman, he rose from his chair, adjusted the cuff of his navy blue suit, and walked toward the stage with slow, measured steps. The weight of the room shifted. Even those who had smirked at the professor's words just moments before now leaned forward, sensing something was about to happen. Taking the microphone, Barron met Professor Keating's gaze directly, his expression calm, almost amused. "Professor," he began, his voice steady and composed, "I find it interesting that a man who prides himself on intellectual rigor would rely so heavily on mockery instead of reasoned argument." A few murmurs spread across the crowd. The professor's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Barron continued, stepping forward. "You speak of reason, of science, and yet you assume that faith is nothing more than ignorance. You claim that belief in God is a sign of intellectual inferiority. But tell me, Professor, does that include Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, or Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, perhaps even Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project?" "Yeah, he died. Chad." He gestured toward the audience, his tone unwavering. Were these men simply uneducated, or could it be that they saw something you refused to acknowledge? A hush fell over the room. Professor Keating's fingers twitched against the podium, as if searching for an immediate retort, but Barron wasn't finished. "You ridicule faith, yet you place your own in something equally intangible, a belief that nothing created everything." His voice carried a quiet strength now. "Tell me, Professor, which requires more blind faith, believing in a creator, or believing that the universe, with all its fine-tuned precision, simply appeared?" For the first time that evening, Keating had no immediate answer, and that's when everyone realized this was no ordinary debate. It was a reckoning. A tense silence gripped the room, the weight of Barron's words still hanging in the air. For the first time that evening, Professor Keating hesitated. His once unshakable confidence had cracked, if only for a moment, but he was a man who had built his career on dismantling faith. He could not afford to falter now. With a forced chuckle, he adjusted his tie, straightened his posture, and attempted to reclaim control. "Oh, come now, Mr. Trump," Keating said, his voice tinged with forced amusement. "You're cherry-picking historical figures as if their personal beliefs validate religion itself. Newton and Planck were men of science, and science, unlike faith, evolves. What we once attributed to divine intervention, we now understand through empirical evidence. Science has replaced superstition." Barron remained still, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate precision, he responded, "Has it, Professor?" His voice was calm but unyielding. "Science explains processes, but it does not explain origins. Tell me, where did life begin? Where did consciousness emerge? Why is the universe's structure so mathematically precise, its physical laws so finely tuned that even a slight variation in gravity or atomic structure would render life impossible? You speak of reason and logic, yet dismissed the greatest question of all. Why does anything exist instead of nothing? A ripple of movement spread through the audience. Some students nodded, others exchanged glances, realizing the debate had shifted in an unexpected direction. Professor Keating let out a strained laugh. "You're playing the God of the Gaps argument, Mr. Trump. Just because we don't have all the answers now doesn't mean we won't in the future." Barron's lips curled into a slight smile. "Precisely, Professor. You believe science will eventually explain it all. But belief in something unseen, something unproven, what is that? If not faith?" The professor's jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the podium. The logic was undeniable, and for the first time he had no snappy rebuttal, no mocking retort. The crowd leaned in, sensing the power shift. "I thought you championed free thought," Barron added. "Yet here you are, ridiculing anyone who thinks differently from you. Is it possible, Professor, that the greatest intellectual weakness is not faith, but intellectual arrogance?" Keating opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in his career, he looked truly uncertain. The silence in the auditorium was suffocating. Professor Keating stood frozen, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The once commanding intellectual, known for dismissing faith with ruthless efficiency, now looked as though he had been cornered in a debate he had never expected to lose. His carefully crafted persona of absolute certainty was crumbling before the watchful eyes of his students. Barron Trump took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. His voice, though steady, carried an unmistakable finality. "Professor," he said, each word deliberate, "you claim faith is a crutch for the weak, yet here you stand, unable to defend your own beliefs without resorting to mockery. Tell me, which one of us is truly afraid?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some students glanced at one another, while others stared straight ahead, transfixed. Keating opened his mouth, desperate for a retort, but nothing came. The sharp, calculated words he had wielded so effortlessly for years failed him now. Barron let the silence stretch before delivering his final blow. "You call religious people intellectually inferior," he continued. "Yet in this very room, in this very moment, you have failed to counter even the most basic theological arguments from a student. So, tell me, Professor, which is it? Are believers truly ignorant, or are you simply unprepared?" A few gasps escaped from the audience. Keating's face burned red, his composure disintegrating under the weight of his own arrogance. The laughter that had once filled the auditorium at his expense was now replaced with a thick, unbearable stillness. Barron took one last glance at the professor before stepping back from the microphone. The battle was over. For a long moment, Keating simply stood there, his eyes darting around the room, searching for some lifeline of credibility. But there was none. Even his most devoted students sat motionless, their admiration now tainted with uncertainty. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single student began to clap. Another followed, and then another. Soon the entire auditorium erupted into thunderous applause, not for the professor, but for the young man who had single-handedly dismantled an empire of arrogance in one night. And as Professor Keating lowered his head, he knew his career would never be the same again. The thunderous applause continued to swell, filling every corner of the Grand Columbia University auditorium. Barron Trump remained composed, offering only a slight nod of acknowledgement as he stepped away from the podium. He wasn't one to revel in victory, but the energy in the room was undeniable. The students knew what they had just witnessed, a complete dismantling of a man who had spent decades silencing voices like Barron's with nothing but arrogance and ridicule. Meanwhile, Professor Keating stood motionless, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched. His once commanding presence had withered beneath the sheer weight of his own failure. He had been the undisputed intellectual force of this institution, the man who had reduced countless students to uncomfortable silence, the professor whose words had never before been challenged so effectively. Yet now, he was the one left speechless. Slowly, students began to rise from their seats, forming quiet clusters of discussion. Some exchanged hushed whispers, while others eagerly scrolled through their phones, already typing out what they had just witnessed. In the digital age, this moment would not stay confined to the walls of this auditorium. By morning, clips of the exchange would be circulating across social media platforms, conservative news outlets, and debate forums worldwide. Keating rubbed his temples, still gripping the podium, his mind scrambling for something, anything, to salvage what remained of his credibility. But there was no undoing what had happened. He had come to this debate expecting an easy victory, but instead he had walked into a reckoning. Barron turned to leave, the echoes of applause still reverberating in the room. Just as he reached the steps leading off the stage, a student, a young woman who had sat near the front, approached him hesitantly. "That was incredible," she murmured, her voice filled with something between admiration and disbelief. "I've sat through dozens of his lectures and I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that." Barron offered a small, knowing smile. "Truth doesn't need permission to be spoken," he replied simply. As he stepped out into the corridor, the cool night air hitting his face, he knew one thing for certain. Tonight wasn't just a debate. It was a turning point, and the world was watching. The screen fades to black, the echoes of the night's events lingering in the minds of all who had witnessed them. Then slowly, the voiceover begins, calm yet commanding, carrying the weight of what had just transpired. That night, a professor who had built his legacy on tearing down faith was humbled, not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet conviction of a young man who refused to be silenced. For years, skeptics have claimed that faith and intellect cannot coexist, that belief in God is the mark of a weak mind. And yet, when confronted with true reason, true logic, and true confidence in something greater, it was the skeptic, not the believer, who was left without words. The screen transitions to a montage of iconic historical figures: Newton, Planck, Pascal, Einstein, all men of faith, all giants of intellect. Their images fade one by one, replaced by the glowing skyline of New York City, a symbol of progress, innovation, and the ever-evolving pursuit of truth. The greatest irony is this: those who claim religion is a crutch often use their own arrogance as one. They mock, they belittle, they ridicule, not because they have answers, but because they fear the possibility that they may be wrong. That faith is not ignorance, but strength. That belief is not weakness, but wisdom. The screen shifts again to a clip of Barron Trump walking out of the auditorium, his posture unwavering, his presence commanding. The narration continues. What we witnessed tonight was more than a debate. It was a reminder that faith is not something to be ashamed of, that truth does not require validation from those who mock it, and that when faced with arrogance, the most powerful response is not outrage, but quiet, unwavering conviction. The music swells, a slow, powerful crescendo. The words appear on screen. The battle for truth is not over. It has only just begun. Then in bold white letters, if this story inspired you, don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Like, subscribe, and share this message, because truth deserves to be heard, and faith deserves to be defended. A beat of silence, then the final words. God bless you, and God bless America. The screen fades to black. The message remains. In today's America, it's easy to feel like faith and values are under attack. Everywhere we turn, someone is trying to redefine truth, silence beliefs, or mock those who stand firm in what they know is right. But as Barron Trump showed us, true strength isn't about yelling the loudest. It's about standing your ground with confidence, facts, and conviction. The lesson here is clear. Never let arrogance intimidate truth. People will try to dismiss your faith, your morals, your principles, But that doesn't mean you shrink back. It means you stand taller. We see it in classrooms, in workplaces, in the media. This pressure to conform, to compromise, to stay quiet. But silence is exactly what they want. Instead, we must do what Barron did. Stay calm, stay sharp, and refuse to back down. When someone challenges your beliefs, don't get defensive. Get smart. Know your values, know your arguments, and be ready to speak with wisdom, not anger. Because truth doesn't need to be aggressive. It just needs to be unapologetic. And that's where you come in. Have you ever faced a moment where your faith or values were challenged? How did you respond? Drop a comment below and share your experience. Let's start a conversation. If this story inspired you, don't just scroll away. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more content that stands up for truth. Because in a world that wants you silent, the most powerful thing you can do is speak up. And that, my friends, is what being an American is all about.